I'm Simon Earith from Yes. This is my colleague James Musgrave, and we're honoured to be speaking at the Google Span conference today. Between myself and James, we run a 5-strong studio here in London, about half a mile away. We both trained as graphic designers and occasionally refer to ourselves as such. But the work we do now exists in many areas outside graphic design itself. Our interests lie in visual art, photography, technology, film, literature, possibly more than graphic design, and that reflects in some of the work we make. The work spans physical and digital output, and in this presentation, we've chosen to talk about projects that relate to each other beyond the final format that they take. The first project that we're going to talk about is one for Warp Records that we did a few years ago. It was a project to create the visual communication and identity around a number of events and music releases celebrating Warp's 20th anniversary. The project was titled Warp 20. From quite early on, we had an idea that the music itself, or Warp, the record label, as an entity, could be featured within the artwork. We originally started looking at mathematical shapes and were attracted to the way these forms have a mysterious or enigmatic quality. We created a number of visuals that combined these mathematical derived objects with actual environments, as we thought the object became much more interesting and powerful when contextualized in the real world. One of the issues we encountered that these early tests started to look kind of like bad public sculpture, quite heavy and static, and that wasn't the idea we wanted to convey at all. Through more research into mathematically based objects, using Google image search, we were reminded of the Mobius strip. The real breakthrough of the project came from a very low-tech experiment, actually. We made a Mobius strip out of a bit of paper. And tried throwing it in the air in order to photograph it. We took these images of the Mobius and then applied them to a carefully selected group of landscape images that had a kind of non-place quality. Many of the photographs that we used to visualize the idea were created by the photographer Dan Holsworth. And this is the point that we started to make a connection with Stanley Kubrick's 2001, which was mentioned earlier. Stanley Kubrick's obelisk, this sort of powerful object, was rooted in the ground. The idea that we were developing was something much more living and evolving.
So through making these visuals, we convinced ourselves that the only way to realize the idea in its ultimate form was to use a real Mobius rather than a computer-generated version. We felt these floating versions we made had this kind of hyper-real quality that we wouldn't be able to match using CGI. Plus, we liked the idea of collaborating with a photographer. So once we had the approval of the label, we set about the process of making a real-world fabricated object, which was surprisingly difficult on a number of levels. The thing we love about the Mobius strip is it's such a simple object to make out of paper, but it's actually mathematically and structurally really complex. The first thing we encountered was the problem of actually making a 3D computer model of the Mobius to make in real life. We discovered from our tests that a Mobius shape is defined by the rigidity of the material. So we looked at a perfect mathematical Mobius, and we felt it looked too rigid and lifeless. So we tried modeling the shape a number of ways in 3D, but we ended up making this small paper version, which we scanned in 3D, as the paper version had the exact tension in the material to create a shape that held itself open, but didn't look lifeless, like the mathematically perfect Mobius. The only thing we altered from the paper version was we added this wing cross-section, which would add structural integrity to the final object. So the object was then CNC routed out of a 1.5 meter block of foam.
It's worth mentioning that one of the things about creating this kind of real-world version was the fact that you could move it very slightly and create these incredibly different forms, so it almost looked like it was morphing, as we proved in the sort of paper test that we made. So for the photo shoot, we worked with the artist Dan Holsworth, whose images we'd used for the original tests. The shoot itself took place over a couple of weeks, thousands of miles. It was a really interesting challenge, exploring how to best realize the concept and finding the right kind of locations that allowed the Mobius to appear iconic. As you can see from this image, it wasn't a particularly glamorous expedition. We were staying in Alan Partridge-style travel lodges and eating sandwiches in a car most days. An added stress was the fact that we completely underestimated the weight of the final model, and it couldn't be held up by wires and stands as we'd originally thought. We had to clamp it and position it and rest it on top of the flight case that we were carrying it about in, which would then be removed later. The worrying part of this was that a large gust of wind could potentially blow the whole construction down, and this would smash the Mobius to pieces, and we obviously didn't have the budget for a backup version. Out of the hundreds of images we shot, we chose 20 to make into finalized images, each one of these representing 1 year of the life of Warp at that stage. The images that we produced became part of the communication material, posters for events, record covers, a deluxe box set that you can see here. And this was a special edition that contained vinyl, CDs, publication, posters, etc. There were other graphic elements, typographic and various logos, but for us, the concept, art direction, and really the photography, I guess, was the real sort of meat of the project. The music magazine Wired reviewed the box set and said about the artwork, as the purple Mobius strip that forms the central motif of the artwork cry out, this collection is all about unification. There are no two sides of this label, just a single unending totality that is Warp.
So, although we're not photographers, one thing we came to understand from compiling together this set of projects is that photography is a massive part of what we do. Most of our projects are actually much more minimalist and reductive than something like Warp 20, which is about as involved as you can get with image making and art direction. Often our role is actually more about making some sort of vessel for someone else's image-based content. So Dan, who we collaborated with on Warp 20, is someone we've worked with on a number of projects, and the most recent of which was the design of his website. When we first started work on this project, it was at a time when not many established artists had websites or realized the value in having a website. The direction for the site was something we discussed at length with Dan, and in the end we agreed we wanted to try and take all of Dan's output online. So this included a visual archive of all Dan's exhibitions, related essays, publications, collaborations, etc. We think it's important for artists to have real control over how they're represented online. Considering the way that imagery is disseminated online, we think it's essential to control the primary source. So in a way, Dan's site has become this kind of evolving catalogue raisonné, which is a kind of an idea that exists in print. With this site, we wanted to give a real sense to the, of depth and wealth to the content, but we also wanted to feel immediate. We really love archival projects, and we wanted to make this design system that was adaptable to a wide range of content. This version of Dan's site is actually a second iteration. What we tried to do was we took this idea that was originally existed in the original Twitter iPad app, this idea of the sliding panels, and we really liked it because it created this kind of real tangible connection between the content. A lot of what we try to do in our sites is kind of compact this perception of the distance between content. The idea being if people feel content's closer, they can kind of get to it easier, and they feel it's easier to find. Yeah, makes sense.
Aside from the websites, we also believe that books are still a relevant format. As this is the case, we run a small publishing imprint, Yes Editions, I'm going to talk a little bit about our latest book, Ways of Knowing, available now. Through another couple of books we produce, we were contacted by a photographer called Daniel Steer, who had developed a project that he was keen to publish. The two distinct yet related bodies of work, one was about research labs, largely featuring humans attached to strange contraptions, and a series of visual experiments carried out in Daniel's studio. A key concern of ours was to connect these related components, but also allow them to exist in their own right. We ultimately achieved this through a slightly disorientating approach to the format of the book itself. It was 2 independent volumes bound within a single cover, which was then contained within a PVC dust jacket. This, in effect, meant the book had 2 separate covers and had to be flipped to view the 2 sets of content. Additionally, due to the orientation of the images, the labs are presented in a different orientation than the studio experiments, which sort of adds to that idea of disorientation.
So our site here for photographer Ben Stockley is a good example of a continuation of the ideas from both the site for Dan and the Ways of Knowing book. So again, it uses physical metaphors to try and create an experience that we think feels more tangible. Ben's work, we felt, had this sort of ethereal quality that we wanted to enhance through the way the visitor interacted with it. To us, the idea of linear structure seemed too rigid. Instead, we wanted to create this ambiguous sense of scale where the work as a whole actually meant more than a single image. Like with Ways of Knowing, we felt a small amount of disorientation actually added to the experience. So this zoom technique with the image grid is something we've experimented a number of times, but this is the first time we put it into production. The idea originally came from research by a guy called Jeff Raskin, who did a lot of experimentation with zoomable user interfaces. And in this instance, what we were trying to enforce was this idea that the user was viewing a small part of a larger whole. Often when photographers come to us and they create their work in a particular form of output in mind, usually like a book or a magazine, and it can occasionally be difficult to persuade them that their form of the content online should be different. And yeah, Ben took quite a lot of convincing that this was a good idea. And in the end, we had to just make it and show him and convince him that this was going to be great, and he agreed.
It's also worth mentioning that the technical complexities of this meant we actually programmed the site using a gaming engine called Pixie.js, which actually allowed us to use switch between different resolution images to get this sort of smooth effect that you can see.
It also meant we could accelerate the graphics using WebGL where available, but fall back for Canvas if it's not available.
Quite a lot of our work kind of looks quite simple on the surface, but can be extremely technically challenging to get to the idea that we're trying to achieve. We don't particularly make prototypes beforehand. Well, there's specific cases. This was one, but a lot of our projects actually were just kind of the design stage and the development stage completely sort of bleed into one. We're a small company and everyone sits on the same sort of large desk, and it's just a very sort of fluid transition. There's no sort of hard lines between those two sort of sides or disciplines, if you like. It's much more free-flowing. Last year, we worked with an amazing photographer called Solver Sunsbo. We've admired his work for a long time, and it was great to get the commission to collaborate with him. Solver didn't really want a website to be a commercial selling tool, as many people do. He's already very successful and represented by a really big agent in the US. He wanted to achieve something that was sort of the digital equivalent of a beautifully produced book or exhibition. An unexpected aspect of the brief was that Solver wanted a sense of discovering something rather than presenting in an easy-to-consume format. He didn't even mind the fact that some people might not be able to access the site beyond the home page because it had no commercial objective. That wasn't a particular concern. Our response to this was to create a site that was distilled down to its essential elements as we saw them, extremely minimalistic and reductive in order to put the work at the fore. When you get to the site, you see a featured piece of work. There's no traditional navigation menu, just his name at the top and the word work at the foot. Clicking on this takes you through to a sort of fluid scrolling parallax page, which you probably just saw earlier. And as you scroll through, videos play when they come into focus. You mouse over the images and get a little bit of text feedback. In one part of the site, the folio, if your mouse is stationary for a little while, actually all the text disappears, so you're left with kind of no design, if you like, in a traditional sense, and that's something that we found quite funny, the fact that, we're sort of counting ourselves out of the equation. There's no evidence of what we've done in a way, but obviously a lot of decision-making and thought and iteration goes into all those different aspects of it, and the things like the timing of things and the transitions and all those very subtle details, when everything else is completely reduced, become massively important. Beyond, a physical book which has a tactile quality, materials involved. It's like, how do you make a website that has that sense of quality yet is really minimalistic? And this is an idea that we think is really interesting to explore. So lastly, I'm just going to talk briefly about another individual artist website, this time for a French photographer called Laetitia Negre. This was done after Solver, and in some ways it continues some of the ideas we explored there. It was completely image-based and devoid of any textual content in some places, which is obviously great for your Google ranking. And it expands on the client-controlled layout and design tools that we developed for Solver, and this was done via our CMS. The initial idea suggested to us was of a very effects-driven site, particle effects, Photoshop style distortion, pixelation, transitions. We thought this could be an interesting idea to explore, but wanted to make sure that it wasn't gratuitous and didn't overpower the work itself. We tried to achieve this by concentrating on a very narrow range of transitions, mainly wipes that originated in film editing, but due to the static nature of this, we were more thinking of PowerPoint presentations and kind of getting a balance between the unexpectedness and complete sort of kitsch overload. We like the challenge of moving beyond this idea of a digital monograph that we'd previously tried to achieve and create something more ephemeral and immediate, maybe something more akin to a fashion magazine. While we're prototyping projects like these, we're obviously working with much of the final imagery, and that way we can explore how far we can push things while still making it about the work.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Next up are the guys from Colophon, who are friends and collaborators of ours. We're actually working on a project with them at the moment, which is going to be released next year. So please keep an eye out for that. Thanks for listening.